Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity, the channel devoted to helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. I'm Dan Patterson, and in this episode of our conversation series, we're going to be talking to Dr. Callum Miller, a medical doctor and a philosopher who teaches on bioethics at the University of Oxford, and also to Lois McClatchy Miller, a lawyer who's worked both in the context of the UN and in the UK with a focus on human rights advocacy. Now, these two, as you may have picked up from the name, are in fact newlyweds, and theirs is a sweet story. But the subject of this episode is a heavy one: abortion. Over the course of this episode, we will be picking up on the tragic realities of sexual abuse and rape. And so our viewers and our listeners are warned to be careful in what may provoke trauma or raise negative feelings from their past. But given how big this conversation is, the number of lives that it affects right around the world, we wanted to bring on two voices who can speak to it from the pro-life angle with clarity and compassion, to be able to shed light on the biblical, scientific, medical, philosophical, and legal elements of this question. Now, many of you who are listening to this are undoubtedly pro-choice. It's the dominant view in much of the Western world. And so if nothing else, I hope this episode at least gives you a view from the other side, that maybe a more conservative or pro-life angle on these things isn't as bigoted, anti-woman, or evil as you may have imagined. Maybe even there's something good to be considered here. I hope you find this episode helpful as you consider how to think about abortion. Well, Lois and Callum, it's fantastic to have you on the channel. I think it's for the very first time, so thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Pleasure. I think it's early morning over there in the UK for you guys, yeah?
Well, it's early. I mean, it's 10:30.
That's early for the UK crew. And a big congratulations on your recent wedding. Callum, I actually think I may have seen a kilt in action. You have to tell us about the celebrations.
Yeah, well, Lois is fully Scottish. I'm a quarter Scottish, and it's had a big impact on my family as well. So we got married in Scotland, and so there was no real option. I protested, but I didn't really have a choice on the kilt.
I think you almost need a best man in that situation to help you get one of those things on properly without any dangers. But you guys obviously started out your wedding with a bang sort of into new married life, because I've seen you all over the place on social media doing different advocacy right throughout Europe. How's the first few months of married life been?
Yeah, it's been really fun. I mean, everyone says the first year of marriage is the hardest. We're kind of waiting for that to start. We're having a great time so far. It's been great to kind of have the same mission in mind, and we're working on a lot of the same projects, which makes it a fun kind of team.
So cool. Well, if we could kind of start with you then, Lois, can you tell us a little bit about your own story, maybe particularly what got you interested in doing this kind of public advocacy, especially on the topic of the unborn?
Yeah, thanks. So I actually started out doing work on the unborn in the context of surrogacy. So when I was at university, I was doing my legal master's, and I was looking at the question of selling children before birth and that whole kind of ethical question. And that really, although I already had an interest in bioethics and Christianity and how this kind of worked in society, that really sharpened my thinking and my study of what it means to have human rights, why we would deny human rights to one element of society and not another, the historical context of that. And from there, I did a few programs with a group called ADF International, which I now work for, which is a kind of legal advocacy group which works on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but also the most fundamental right of all, the right to life. And now I kind of get to go out and speak about their cases and their work and the causes that they fight for in the public square. So that was my kind of journey.
Yeah. It's been cool to see, and I really appreciate even just seeing the diversity of sort of roles that you get to play in different places that you speak. I think we saw you in Bratislava as the support crew recently for Callum while he was speaking there at a rally. But Callum, we met years ago, actually. I think first in Oxford, with different places around the world we've hung out. I think you're a pro at falling asleep on couches in group settings, if I remember correctly. But I've always found you a little bit intimidating, because I sort of describe you as a professional juggler. Sometimes you're somehow a medical doctor who still does a little bit of work here here and there within the NHS. You obviously are doing work in philosophy, doing research and writing in the area of bioethics, and a bit of teaching at Oxford University. And you're huge in sort of public advocacy and pro-life space, speaking at rallies all over the place. But that's not the thing I've found impressive about you, as amazing as that CV might be. I've really just appreciated the clarity and compassion and the way you can just speak so clearly on these sorts of subjects. And so it's great to have you on. I'm curious if you'd just sort of share with our audience as well a little bit about your own story and what kind of led you to being a prominent voice in the pro-life movement.
Sure. Well, I think, probably you didn't find my height intimidating, because probably very straight 4 feet. So I didn't grow up in a very religious family. Definitely didn't grow up in a pro-life family. Still, to be honest, haven't really spoken to my family about it. At medical school, I changed my mind. So I was pro-choice until about halfway through medical school, and then really just looking at the arguments, the evidence, seeing the reality of life in the womb, the reality of abortion, and then the reality of how abortion affects women, and meeting women who have been through this and really struggled as a result. All of these things got me to rethink my sort of prejudices. I mean, I grew up in a country which is about 95% pro-choice. And so it's easy just to go along with the crowd and believe what everyone else believes without really properly thinking about it. And so I was in that position, but being at medical school in Oxford really allowed me just to challenge my own perceptions. And as unpopular as it made me with a few people, I really just felt I had to go where the truth led and where the evidence led. And so ended up changing my mind. I became pro-life. And then I guess I felt that I had to speak about it because no one else really was. Even in churches, no one really kind of ever speaks about it here. And so I never really planned on doing this, but doors just kept on opening, and I found myself speaking in government situations or in churches, universities, whatever. And I think it's been helpful that, I suppose, although I think Christianity sort of confirms and coheres with my view on abortion, it wasn't what led me to it. What led me to it was really the conviction that all humans are equal, and that if that's the case, then we have to include human beings from the very beginning of their development, which is in the womb. And so it was really thinking through human equality and then looking at the impact of abortion on women that sort of pushed me in this direction. And as I said, with 1 in 4 pregnancies in my country ending in abortion, it's a huge, huge issue that affects almost everyone in some way. And I really felt like if no one else is speaking about this, then I feel like I should at least try and step in myself.
Well, I'm really thankful to have the two of you on here to be able to provide a whole range of windows into the subject, whether from sort of theology background, you've also got a master's in biblical studies, Callum, but also from the philosophy and the medical and scientific side, and certainly from the legal side as well, and the first-hand experience of people that you obviously know. Obviously, this is a hugely sensitive subject, and for maybe about 2 decades, I've been doing public Q&As about Christianity, and I could count on one hand the number of times I've been asked this in a public Q&A. But in the last 12 months, it has exploded, probably prompted by what's gone on in the US in 2022 with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that sort of precedent by the Supreme Court there. And mostly what people want to know is whether I am pro-life or pro-choice. For some people who might be listening and isn't all that familiar with those words, Callum, do you want to just spell out those two positions for us briefly?
Sure, I think, so pro-life, both of them sound like good things, right? Everyone thinks they're in favor of choice, everyone thinks they're in favor of life. The issue at the crux of the abortion debate, I suppose, is whether the woman's choice to end the life is more important or more legally or morally significant, or whether the child's life is more significant. And there's sort of a conflict between those, inevitably. So pro-life people believe that for various reasons, but usually they believe something like the child in the womb is a human being, as science shows, and there's a clear biological consensus that life begins at fertilization. And therefore, if we believe in human equality, we have to say that they have the same equal status, which means the same fundamental rights as anyone else. And of course, the fundamental right of all the human rights is the right to life, which means that their life has to be protected. So in international law, it says that every human being has the inherent right to life. And then it says this right shall be protected by law. So in that sense, for pro-lifers, it's not just about sort of holding up life as an ideal or saying that it's a good idea or saying that we should encourage it. It's also saying that the fundamental right to life is something that has to be protected by law. Now, all of us agree with that when it comes to born human beings. We all say that the right to life, of course, should be protected by law. The pro-life view is really just an extension of that. It says that it should extend to every human being, not just some human beings. The pro-choice side, by contrast, says that for a number of different reasons, this right to life either doesn't exist or is less important. And there are sort of three main arguments for a pro choice kind of perspective. I'm ignoring those arguments which historically have been quite prominent to do with population control and that sort of thing, which they're still part of the debate, but they're not at the forefront usually of these ethical debates. But there are three main arguments. One is to say that it's not a person. So even though it's a human being, the baby is not a person, which means that it doesn't have a full sort of moral status or legal status because it's not fully developed or because it doesn't have self-consciousness or it's not autonomous, something like that. Of course, that gets very controversial and we can talk about that if you want, but the first sort of kind of argument is to say that the baby is not fully a person. The second kind of argument is to say, well, even if it is a person, even if it does have the right to life, the woman's choice over her body is more important than that. So the baby could have a right to life, but the woman's choice is more important even then. And then the third sort of argument says, even if you grant everything that the pro-lifer says about the status of the child and the fact that the right to life is more important, so even if you say that abortion is wrong, suppose we can all agree that it's wrong, it's still a bad idea to put that into legislation for some practical reason, like it would eliminate women's equality or it would cause unsafe abortions, which lead to health problems and that sort of thing. So those are the sort of three main arguments or kinds of arguments that have been given for the pro-choice side historically.
Yeah, I appreciate just spelling out some of that territory. And I really want to return to these arguments in a minute as we focus on sort of the ethical aspect of the conversation. What is the morally or ethically right and good thing to do in a whole host of different scenarios? But obviously this is an incredibly controversial subject. You mentioned that the majority of people in your country would register as pro-choice. I'm sure that's probably the same here in a largely secularized Australia. But both sides of this conversation tend to feel like their position is the righteous one, and they're on the side of good, whether protecting the rights of women and their determination and well-being in this life and trying to minimize the suffering of future humans, or whether it's on the pro-life side, trying to guard considered vulnerable babies in the womb and what should be the safest place. And so this conversation tragically just seems to descend into mess and demonization and people shouting at each other, and you see that play out on YouTube clips a lot. I'm curious for the two of you, as you sort of enter into these conversations regularly, whether at public advocacy level and doing public speeches, or whether it's just in private conversations with people who care. And maybe I can start with you on this, Lois, and feel free to chime in, Callum, as well. But when you do speak on this subject, what are some of the ways that you try and be sensitive to the trauma and potential high temperatures that this conversation can evoke to kind of cut through suspicion or show genuine care in the conversation?
Yeah, I think the greatest cause of misunderstanding in the abortion debate is that it's woman versus child. So people think that like the pro-child side is like the pro-woman side, and women matter and the baby doesn't matter at all. And other people think that the pro-life side is like only the baby matters and like forget about the woman, leave her to die. We only care about the child. And that's a really uncharitable reading of both, to be honest. But the position that we want to make is actually somewhere in the middle of that. And we say, actually, we can find solutions where both lives matter, or we can support women and baby together and find solutions where they can both thrive individually and together. So I think breaking down that dichotomy of maybe what's seen on YouTube, where it's, this very simplified debate of woman versus child, and saying, actually, no, let's forget the politics for a second and just find a solution which is good for everybody in the scenario. I think that's a good mental framework to have when entering these conversations. And then, of course, in our country, at least, I think it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women have had an abortion themselves. So when you're speaking publicly or speaking to somebody that you don't know so well, or even someone that you do know pretty well, there's quite a high likelihood that you may be speaking to someone who's had experience of abortion themselves. So bearing that in mind and having that compassion and realizing that there is, if you're coming at this from a Christian angle, there is grace, so much grace available, and having that framework in your mind of like, we're not there to condemn, but we are there to point to truth, and with grace and truth working together in that conversation. And that's something to really have at the forefront of your mind as well. How would have anything else?
Yeah, I think, like you say, both sides see themselves as morally right, and I think that's part. I think recognizing that is part of the solution. In that, it's so easy for both sides to just attribute bad motivations to the other side. So pro-lifers say, "Oh, you just want to kill babies." That is occasionally true historically, and I'm not denying that that's ever the case, but it's usually not. And likewise, the pro-choice side sometimes says, "Oh, you just want to control women." Now, obviously, that's not the case. It's blindingly obvious to anyone who has a good faith sort of approach to this that the reason pro-lifers do this is not to control women. It's because they genuinely believe this is another human being that has to be protected. So for me, I think just recognizing the good intentions is really important, even when the opinion expressed is so opposite to what we think goodness actually is. We have a friend who used to run the UK's largest abortion provider, and most people are really surprised that we can be friends just because we disagree in such opposite ways on this. But the reality is that I have no doubt that she believes she's doing the right thing. She trusts the same with us. And because we have that sort of understanding, it's actually led to some really beneficial and fruitful conversations. So I think being charitable and assuming the best intentions is really critical to these sorts of issues.
It's a really helpful insight just on the charity of where people are coming from. You hear so often as well that we misdiagnose people's intentions in 9 out of 10 scenarios. And so I think charity is just a brilliant principle to play into that. Now, both of you have mentioned that what's driven your convictions towards the pro-life argument has been truth. I'm curious, though, both of you are committed Christians. What place does Christian faith also play when it comes to this conversation around abortion?
Yeah, well, I think there's multiple reasons why we're pro-life, and a lot of it is empirical data about the traumatic impacts that abortion can have on women, the blatant medical evidence that a child in the womb is a person and needs protection. And so there is plenty of data and solid argument that means that anyone can be very convinced of the pro-life argument without necessarily having a faith. But I also think it's absolutely true that the Christian message runs very much in parallel with the pro-life one, in that we are challenging a culture of death and destruction and one without hope, and we're saying that there is hope, there is life, and there is better. It's if you go back to ancient Rome, actually there's a lot of talk about ancient Rome these days.
I think about it all the time.
You think about it every day, do you then? But if we do think about that in our daily thought today, in ancient Rome it was very common to have infanticide, and their kind of method of abortion, and there was no legal consequence to getting rid of your children because you owned them. If you didn't want a baby girl, which a lot of people didn't fancy a daughter, they wanted a son, it was very common to just expose them in a garbage heap, leave them to die, because that child had no worth, no human rights. And anyone today can look back and say, wow, that's abhorrently wrong. But the reason why we think that is wrong today is because when Christianity entered the scene in ancient Rome, it transformed our way of measuring the worth of every person. So instead of saying you're valuable if you are on the top of the social food chain, if you have money, wealth, status, you have all of the rights and all of the power. If you're a slave, if you're a woman, if you are any child of any vulnerable situation, then you don't have any rights and you can be left to die, you can be murdered, there's no consequence. So Christianity came in and has had this revolutionary framework that we now take for granted of human rights, of saying every single person has equal worth and dignity. And that's the framework that we take into this abortion debate now, as we say, there is solutions to be compassionate and kind to every single human being, whether that's a vulnerable woman who finds herself in a crisis pregnancy and her child, who she's carrying within her, who is innocent and has all the rights that I do today, walking around, in terms of my right to life, my right to have a future, my right to grow up in the world, etc. So I think bringing that Christian framework gives an understanding that is kind of overlooked as to why we believe that, although many people now adopt a human rights framework and understanding without tracing it back to Christianity, but that's kind of the base.
Yeah, I think the other thing to say on that is just that, as Lois says, Christianity lays the framework of saying all humans are valuable, and in Christian history, it's been very unanimous, and even in the Bible itself, it talks about life in the womb and how it's valued by God, and even mentions conception. But throughout most of Christian history, they didn't know when conception was or what it was, and they certainly didn't know about fertilization in detail. And so, what's interesting is that for much of Christian history, they actually didn't say that it was a human being from, a day or 5 days after intercourse. They didn't know really when a human life exactly began. And so they didn't say that abortion was really bad until later in pregnancy. Um, what changed was in the sort of 18th, 19th century when scientists discovered fertilization. And then what you see is that across the sort of Anglo American world, at least, that is when you started to get legislation saying that life has to be protected from fertilization. It wasn't because they suddenly discovered some new writings of the Pope or because they suddenly reinterpreted the Bible. It was actually the science that was driving the legislation that, when it came to fertilization. So the Bible doesn't talk about life beginning at fertilization because they hadn't discovered fertilization yet. And that for me shows, firstly, that the Bible and Christianity do lay that framework of human rights and equality. And they say that from the very beginning, this is something that should be valued. But it's science that teaches us when that actually begins precisely. So when it comes to the phrase life begins at conception or fertilization, that is fundamentally a scientific claim. And then Christianity combines the ethics with that scientific claim. And that is sort of how you get the pro-life perspective.
Yeah. I really appreciate those insights, and I know even personally, my wife Erin and I, we've got 3 children now, 3 boys. We lost 2 children to miscarriage before our first child was born, and that's common, sadly, as part of people's experience of trying to have children. But also there's a lot of questions that are wrapped up in that sort of thing. I remember being deeply encouraged actually reading through Luke chapter 2 and the stories of Jesus's birth, sort of the Christmas narratives of his origin story, and of this account between Mary in her pregnancy as a virgin young woman and rushing to hide away with her cousin, who's an older barren woman, but who's also with miraculous child, with John the Baptizer. And there's this story where Mary comes near to Elizabeth, and where God so moves, the Holy Spirit impacts John the Baptizer, this unborn child in the womb, that he leaps with joy as the presence of Jesus in the womb draws near. And there was just something deeply comforting for me to know of God's care and even interaction with the lives of what are yet pre-conscious babies, a powerful sort of message that the Christian story sends around the value of unborn life, and that God even sees those lives in the womb and kind of cares. Now, Callum, as a doctor, sort of a researcher in this area, you're probably aware, as you've shared, 1 in 4 women roughly in the UK, and then 1 in 3 women, they think globally, somewhere around that, have an abortion somewhere across their lifetime. That's quite a confronting figure, and it means a lot of people who would be watching this right now may have that as part of their own story. I'm curious for the 2 of you, what is the driving motivation for getting involved in these conversations, given that you're the absolute minority in the countries in which you speak, given that it is a deeply personal subject that can raise a lot of trauma or a sense of moral condemnation for others? Why do you think it's worth standing up and talking about this? What are you really hoping to see come about?
Yeah, I think it's what we believe is right. And when you have a choice between what's convenient or popular and what's right, you don't you don't really have a choice, ironically. I think, we have to, it would be very easy for me to make a lot of money, be very popular, do all sorts of stuff, having a different view. I chose kind of the opposite path, and it's just because I believe this is the right thing. Now, Of course, that leads into difficult conversations, but my hope is that by approaching this with grace and compassion, we can actually, have fruitful conversations that don't just lead to arguing or shouting or condemnation. Our perspective as Christians is that all of us have sinned and all of us have contributed to this specific issue of abortion. All of us have been part of degrading humans. We've all been part of coercing women. We've all been part of giving women a sort of lack of opportunity to really flourish. And there are many, many ways in which all of us are part of this problem, whether it's through denying women, the ability to work and have a family together and discriminating against them when they try, whether it's the way that we've treated people in relationships or something like that. All of us are part of this problem. So it's not sort of us going into this saying, you, 1 in 3 people are wrong. It's us saying, look, we've all been part of this problem and we all need to be part of the solution. So let's approach this with humility and grace. And fortunately, through Christianity, we have that. We know that Christianity is enough to satisfy anything that we've done wrong in our past, that God's grace covers absolutely everything. So when I speak about this, I'm not coming I don't speak from a moral platform. I don't kind of get up there and say, I'm the best, everyone should listen to me because I've not done anything wrong and I can tell you what's right and wrong. I'm really coming to this with, I've been part of the problem just as much as anyone else. But now that we recognize the harm that abortion does to the children, as well as the harm that abortion does to women, can we find a better way? Can we find a better solution? Because women deserve better than abortion. And if we really think that both lives matter, which is what we believe, we have to try and find a solution that works for both.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And we'll get maybe towards what that solution might be later in the episode. I did want to start with the ethical conversation, because if the majority of people watching this are already convinced of a pro-choice position, they may think that any pro-life position is dumb or is dangerous, or, as you said, is trying to pull women back into the dark ages and be anti-women. Callum, you might have perhaps heard the slogan, if you can't have a baby, you don't get a say. That you don't really get to speak on any platform as a man to this sort of issue. How do you respond first to that as you do try and have the ethical conversation?
I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I don't know if I'm allowed to answer that even.
You're so present with the uterus.
Yeah.
I think part of it is this issue that men are part of the problem and we have to be part of the solution. I think what taking men out of it has done is lead to a situation where men basically say to women, this is your body, your choice, your responsibility, and your problem. So although abortion was supposed to liberate women and say it's my body, my choice, and I can do whatever I choose, it's actually liberated men much more, because what it means is that there's a lot more sex, a lot more unwanted pregnancies, but instead of the man feeling like he has some say and responsibility, the man is now told, this is a woman's issue, this is nothing to do with you. And so he can now say, this is your body, your problem, and your burden. And so this is what the empirical data shows, is that men have abandoned women much, much more since abortion was legalized. And of course, that leaves a woman not just with a simple solution of abortion, because abortion is never just a simple solution. It's left women with a terrible choice of having to go through an abortion by themselves or having to have and raise a child by themselves. And both of those are burdens that should never be shared just by one person. Both of those are things that you need support. And what the sort of legalization and normalization of abortion has done, and by taking men out of the picture, is that it has actually left those women by themselves. And so evidence shows that there's been a huge increase in single motherhood and therefore an increase in women in poverty since abortion was legalized. Because for many women, it's not just a case of, okay, I'll have an abortion. They don't want an abortion. They say, I want to have the baby, but now there's no one to help me because it's supposedly just my issue. So what it's done is actually throw loads of women into poverty, into single motherhood, which has caused huge problems for them economically and in terms of their career. The other thing, though, I think is that it's just not an honest approach when we think about how we speak about these, other issues relating to women or men. I remember that when Emma Watson came out with her big campaign on feminism, the slogan was he for she, which meant there have to be men as allies in this fight. Because men have to use their platform, their responsibility, in many cases their power or their privilege, in order to fight for the vulnerable, including women. And by just saying that something is a women's issue and men should not have a say, actually removes that. And so for me, it's the same principle here. It's he for she. Men have to use their platform, their responsibility, whatever they have, to fight for the vulnerable. Because only when we work together and only when we, come together and really seek unity and try to protect the vulnerable together do we really make a difference. When we divide men and women and pit them against each other, it only causes huge problems and conflict and nothing gets resolved.
That makes sense. And there's a lot that I feel like is the downfall in these conversations simply by people throwing slogans at each other or, wearing big signs with slogans that just isn't helpful. But language does tend to shape the debate. And I'm curious, Lois, how much do you feel like the choice of language really does shape the ethical debate around abortion?
Oh, 100%. I think, so every conversation with abortion, it actually always kind of trails back to the sexual revolution and the 70s and this big idea that abortion and would enable and free us to have careers and to have independence and freedom and everything we wanted. And we could suddenly we had these kind of role models come in through media, like Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City, who was free, single, and independent, and she didn't need a man, and she didn't have any kids, and she could be a single career girl, and she had all her fulfillment from that. And the messaging and the idea that has perpetuated this, even till today, has been ultimately a lie. And I think a lot of women my age, I'm 28, are now actually folding back on this idea and saying, hey, did we actually want this? Did we want to have this responsibility to do all of ourselves? Do we want to be told that we cannot have success, a career, anything that we want if we don't have abortions? Or can we really not do this and be mothers too? Because most people would like to have children one day as well. So we don't want to be fit into this mold where we can only choose between motherhood and success. So I think slogans like Callum mentioned, like my body, my choice, have really perpetuated that lie. And they've also made us, put in a very vulnerable situation where the man could say, your body, your choice, your problem, you go deal with that. We're not going to be partners in this anymore. But you're a girl boss, you're a single independent woman, so you have the power to deal with that. That's not something that we ever wanted. We want to be situated in places and partnerships where we can share responsibilities and burdens and joys together. So I think that media narrative that has been in place since the 70s and up until a lot of Hollywood today has been very damaging. But I am actually quite encouraged because I do see a bit of a revolt happening from women my age. There's a movie coming out soon called, it's the Disney remake of Snow White. And the main actress who plays Snow White, Rachel Ziegler, she made comments recently saying, oh, well, we don't need Prince Charming in the movie anymore. We may as well just, fire Prince Charming because Snow White's going to be an independent girl boss and she's not going to want marriage or kids. So women don't need anything to do with love anymore. And there was such a backlash from women who were saying, actually, who decided this for us? We actually want to be in a situation where we can find marriage, kids, and have that be part of our lives. And to the extent that Disney have really reconsidered, I think, according to some headlines, and the involvement of that kind of stream of the narrative in the movie. And you can see this kind of change happen now in 2020. So it's interesting to see women kind of stand up for ourselves and say, you know what, we do deserve better than abortion. We do deserve better than this narrative that we've been fed, and we want more.
Yeah, one of the principles I think of ethical conversation and just where there's disagreement and debate in general is to try and step into the shoes of someone who disagrees with you and steel man that argument. Lois, if you were to try and give the best case or the most persuasive argument for the pro-choice position, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say, come on, Lois, you know that you cannot really be a mother and have a successful career. And women of our age, we have been, had all this access to excellent education. We're empowered. We can, be the CEO in the boardroom. And you cannot genuinely do that if you've got 4 kids trailing behind you and you need to pick them up from school. That's just not feasible. So we need abortion to have success. And I think that that is really a failure of society to not provide and make a framework for women to be able to have both. We've kind of fitted the expectation of a woman to go into a man's workplace where he doesn't have that traditional kind of caregiving role. Instead of making the workplace fit around a woman and all her needs and all her dependencies and things like that. So I think society can do a lot of work to shift the structures around supporting motherhood and also allowing women to thrive. So that argument that is put in place to say, really today we can't do it all, we can't be mothers, and we can't be successful, etc. I think we can solve that issue without saying we have to therefore have abortion and end the lives of these children. We have to therefore sacrifice motherhood. I think that's a very archaic way of viewing womanhood.
Yeah, that argument line that you've just put forward, that effectively it's a particular kind of life that we want to free women for, the ability to choose for their own sake, not to have to carry a life or to sacrifice certain dreams for the sake of an unwanted pregnancy. It seems to be the dominant one, and that's the sort of my body, my choice, bodily autonomy one. Callum, I'm curious if that's your same perception, that over the years since scientific development has obviously given us a better understanding of development of life in the womb and of contraception, that some of those developmental arguments maybe are less prominent now. It's not really a person, and maybe more it is just a self-determinism. Now I want the right to choose what kind of life I'm going to have. I'm sure you're familiar, I think I've seen it on your website before, but that argument of bodily autonomy put forward by Judith Jarvis Thomson and that famous violinist argument. Would you be able to maybe spell out what that analogy is that she offers, and maybe for the two of you, why you're just not convinced that these arguments hold as much water as what pro-choice advocates would think?
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this is illustrated to some extent by the laws which are being promoted. So, when abortion was originally legalized in most countries, they set a limit of around 12 weeks. In the US, it was much later. In the UK, it was much later, in a few other places. But they generally said, yes, abortion is okay in the early stages, presumably because it's not fully human or it's not fully a person yet, etc. And now what you see, and many people don't believe this, but you can easily find it online, is that most of the big organizations like Planned Parenthood or abortion groups in individual countries, even the WHO, now say that gestation limits, i.e., stopping abortion after a certain point, are a barrier to women's healthcare and they shouldn't be allowed. And so you see countries like New Zealand a couple of years ago legalizing abortion up to birth. Now, I think that signifies a shift, that this is moving from when does it become a human, because it obviously doesn't become human at birth, to a woman's bodily rights, because then birth makes sense, because that is the time when the woman's body sort of becomes disconnected. So absolutely, I think those sorts of arguments have become more prominent. So Thompson's argument basically says something like this, that suppose you woke up one day and you have a famous violinist connected to your body, because I think their kidney has failed and the only way that they can survive is by having your body sort of filter their blood for them. And Thompson says, well, it's okay for you to disconnect, even though the famous violinist has a right to life. The famous violinist is a human being, they're a person, they have a right to life, but it's still okay for you to disconnect them because they don't have a right to use your body. What's interesting is that she never actually says it's okay to do that or that abortion is okay. She actually admits it might be completely indecent or even callous or cruel, but she says they don't have a right to use your body, and so you're not violating their rights. So even then, it doesn't fully settle the moral question, even if she's completely correct, and she would admit that.
Do you think it's a good analogy for the ethics of abortion or not?
So no, generally no. I mean, this is there are two sort of main criticisms. One is that people say, well, she's actually, even in this situation, it would be wrong to disconnect the violinist. There's a very good feminist philosopher who, I don't know if she's pro-life or pro-choice, but a well-known feminist philosopher actually criticized the argument and said, actually, feminism is about using your resources and to protect the vulnerable. And it has an emphasis on the personal being the political. So we can't just divide the world into sort of personal spheres and private spheres in the same way. She actually says that feminist principles lead to the view that you should actually save this person's life. But the more common response, I suppose, has been to say that this is just not, a good analogy for abortion, because firstly, in the case of abortion, in 99% of cases, which is the huge majority, except for the fraction of 1% which are from sexual violence, the person has done something to put the child in that position. It's not that the child just sort of randomly came there. The person made a decision to do something which would naturally lead to a child. The second sort of disanalogy is that the child is the woman's child rather than just a random stranger like a violinist. And then the third possible sort of disanalogy, at least, is that abortion typically involves a sort of direct attack on the child's body and actively killing it, whereas in Thompson's analogy, it seems to be some sort of passive disconnection that you can easily do without, attacking the person's body. Now, just to put that into context, why those relevant. Basically, if you try to come up with another violinist analogy that was actually similar to abortion, you would have to ask a question like this. Suppose you are drink driving, and when you're drink driving on the roads, you crash into your daughter. And your daughter goes to the hospital as a result, and she needs, significant help. She needs the support from your body. And so therefore the hospital decides to connect your bodies up together because you are the one responsible for this and because it's your daughter and you can help her out. Would it then be right to dismember your daughter, for example? Because she doesn't have a right to use your body, you never asked her to be part of your body. Would it be okay to dismember her? I think most people would say no, of course not. That's absurd. But that is the reality of some abortions. I'm not saying it's the majority of abortions, but second trimester surgical abortions do exactly that. They take the child apart limb by limb, etc. And I think therefore that just illustrates that this is a much more complex case, that abortion is actually very different to how Thompson describes it. It's usually not just unplugging, or disconnecting. It usually involves some sort of attack on the body of the child, which if we put that into a fully developed human being, an adult, I think it makes it easier to see why this argument doesn't quite have as much power as has traditionally been argued.
Yeah. You made note in there that that's in the case of 99% of consensual sex, but could we shift to what is, I'm sure, perhaps the most sensitive and potentially traumatic conversation, which is what about those extreme cases? Lois, when you're doing the mental math and the ethical conversation around abortion, what place does sort of extreme cases play in figuring out what is the right thing to do in any scenario?
Sure. So when we talk about extreme cases, we do know that it is kind of less than 1% when we're talking about these issues, as it's typically rape, fatal fetal abnormality, those kind of things. They are very rare, but at the same time, they do happen, and they happen to real women, and so we have to have an answer and to be thinking about these things. So we don't ever want to dismiss it, even though we know that the majority of cases are not related to these issues. So take rape, for example. I cannot imagine as a woman, and a worse experience, and I have so much empathy and sympathy for women who have gone through that. I can't imagine how tough that must be. What the narrative or the cultural narrative suggests is that therefore, because that woman has been through such a terrible and traumatic experience, the only solution, a plaster cast on this situation, would be that she then has an abortion from the child that she's conceived. And I understand why that's an instinctive reaction to say we should get rid of that child. However, when we take a step back and think about the actual consequences of what that means, we know that rape is a terribly traumatic experience. We also know that abortion can be a terribly traumatic experience. There are thousands of women who suffer from PTSD from their abortion experience alone. It has poses women to a great risk of increased risk of anxiety, depression, drug and alcohol abuse, suicidal thoughts, you name it. So we know that the mental health impact of abortion is not positive. So when you say that abortion is the natural next solution to a rape, what you're actually saying is one traumatic experience should then follow the other. And what does that leave the woman with? Well, now instead of one traumatic experience, she has two. When you look at the stories of those women who have gone ahead and kept children, even though they had potentially started out wanting to have an abortion, when they don't have that option and they go ahead to have their child, I think Callum knows these statistics better than me, is it 95%? 98% of women who were turned away from an abortion, didn't have one even though they wanted one, end up being grateful that they had their child in the end. And you can trace that through the child's life as they grow. I mean, 98% of women say, no, I'm so glad that I have this child with me here today. And I think we have to hear the voices of those testimonies. There are women who are so often shut out of the debate, but they say, a lot of them say, my child gave me a purpose to keep going after I had that traumatic experience. It gave me fulfillment, meaning to carry on and to care for a vulnerable child who is my child. Doesn't have to, in that situation, we can say, like the male has abdicated his role, obviously, and that woman now has a child to take care of, and that gives her something to focus on to, to move on with. So I think we have to really take those voices into consideration instead of just having this abstract idea of, oh, well, of course you should have an abortion and that's that.
And Callum, as a medical doctor, no doubt you're aware that there are some situations that would put the mother's life at risk to continue a pregnancy, whether it's for cancer treatments when they're diagnosed, but the cancer treatment will naturally abort the baby, or whether children are born with significant are screened and considered to have significant abnormalities in sort of fetal development and either won't survive and will be stillborn or will have a very, very difficult short lifespan. What about these sorts of extreme cases? How do you work out what the right thing to do in these scenarios is?
Yeah, I think they're quite different. So for me, a helpful general approach is to again start with human equality. It's not about sort of we don't have to think through abortion in a way that is completely different from any other human being. And what I mean by that is human rights law and most laws around the world allow the taking of life in very limited circumstances, but they don't allow you to take life because the person is poor or disabled or inconvenient, because they had the wrong parents, because they were conceived in the wrong circumstances, etc. You can never end someone's life for those reasons in most countries around the world. There is one exception, really, which is in sort of self-defense. Even then, maybe you don't intend to end the life, but you say, in order to preserve life, it is permissible to do something which ends the life of someone else in order to protect an innocent person. Now, it's worth saying that in most cases of medical emergencies, there is actually no way that you can save the baby. Because if the mother dies from preeclampsia or sepsis or whatever it is, then the baby will die as well. So there's actually no way that you can save the baby in almost all of these cases. And so all you can try and do is save the mother at least. And therefore, you're still preserving the idea that the right to life is the most important thing, and you're trying to save one life rather than no lives. So that's the reality in most of those cases. You might, again, say that it's a kind of self-defense as well, which allows you to not happily or, easily take the life, but you reluctantly do something which ends the pregnancy and unfortunately leads to the child passing away. Now, those are a tiny percentage of abortions. It's a tiny fraction of 1%. And those abortions are legal everywhere in the world, and no one is arguing for them to be made illegal. So, yeah, there's a big debate in America about all these women who are being denied medical care because of the laws. Fundamentally, that's just simply not true. If a woman's life is genuinely in danger, then everywhere in the world it is legal to remove the child, and no one is arguing that that should be taken away. So I think the question of fatal conditions in the child is quite different. There's a lot to say, so I'll try and keep it short. I think the thing I would say is that often many people do not know what it's actually like. And most people in this situation are just advised or recommended or even pressured by their doctors to have an abortion. We have a good friend who was told that their child had Edwards syndrome. and therefore it would be best if they had an abortion. They were pressured to have an abortion. It then turned out that the test was wrong and the baby was completely healthy. And so they nearly went through an abortion for their perfectly healthy child because the test was wrong and because of the pressure. I don't think they would have done it because they're pro life. But, another person in that situation, we know that other people have done. In Ireland, there was a big high profile case where a couple had an abortion after being told their child had Edwards syndrome, and it turned out the child was perfectly healthy. But of course, sometimes the diagnosis is correct. And what I would say is that, again, when we listen to the stories of people who have been in this situation, they overwhelmingly say that having the child was the best thing. In fact, when you look at women who have had abortions in this situation, they often describe it as torture. They say it was the worst thing I've ever been through in my life. These are not early abortions typically. These are 15 weeks, 20 weeks. So the woman is going through labor in some cases, delivering the baby. The only difference is that instead of having a child to care for and spend time with for a few hours or days, they deliver their baby passed away already. So it's a horrible experience. Whereas when you look at studies of women who have kept the baby in such situations, they say, of course, it was tragic, it was difficult, it was a horrendous situation that no one wants to be in. But the few hours or days that I had with my baby were some of the most meaningful times in my life. And I would not give them away for the world. And if I had the same situation in future, I would choose exactly the same. There's a study which says that 98% of parents say exactly that I would do the same again if I was in that decision. So there's a lot more that you can say about that, but I think it's really important that we keep experiences at the forefront, not because experience determines all truth, because of course the ethics remains independent of that. But actually, I think these experiences are not often heard. And when they are, they almost always point towards life as the solution rather than towards abortion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the scale of some of these numbers is really confronting as well. There's the pro-life group, the Guttmacher Institute, which estimates that there are 120 million unwanted pregnancies around the world each year, and that roughly 61% of those end up in abortion, which is an unimaginable figure. It's some 73 million people. It's nearly 3 times the population of my country. I think it's about bang on where you guys are in the UK. It's a huge amount, a country's worth of life not seen every single year. Callum, when you look at these sorts of numbers, sociologically speaking now, both of you have mentioned along the way that the heartbeat to want to make a real difference. What are some of the reasons why women tend to seek such high numbers of abortions globally?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is that the Guttmacher Institute does inflate their numbers. They use a methodology which overestimates because they can say, in Nigeria, for example, there are millions of abortions anyway, and so you might as well legalize abortion because the law isn't making a difference. So the Guttmacher Institute, which advocates for abortion, does use a bad methodology, which overestimates. But the point is still true. There are millions and millions, tens of millions around the world each year. When you look at the reasons, so in terms of the extreme reasons, we have good data from the UK, which keeps good documentation on these. We know that something like 0.01% are for medical emergencies for the woman. About 1.5% are because the child has some kind of disability, and that can be any kind of disability. About a quarter of those are for babies with Down syndrome. Data from Florida suggests that about 0.1% are because of sexual violence, which leaves basically around 98.5% everything else. And generally, it's sort of a mix, and we don't actually have great data on the exact reasons, but it's sort of a combination of not in a stable relationship or not in a relationship with the right partner, interference with career, interference with education, doesn't feel like it's the right time, or in some cases, I don't want any more children. So those are the sorts of broad reasons. But in terms of getting down into the detail of those, why exactly do women feel like having a baby will disrupt their career? Is it discrimination or is it something else? We actually don't have as good data as we should. And so we really want to do more research on that.
Lois, as someone who's engaged more in the legal conversation around this as well, there's often a pro-choice objection that were you to develop legislation more in a pro-life favor, that actually increases the number of abortions, that simply legislating something doesn't make a difference. How do you respond to that critique?
Sure. Well, I'll start off in the UK, where we have a criminal law that kicks into place after 24 weeks. So yeah, you can get abortion for almost any reason, kind of, up until 24, and then afterwards it would become a prosecutable offence unless in certain circumstances, such as if your child has a disability. There's been actually a few cases recently, but one particularly hit the news. Carla Foster, who decided to abort her own baby at 34 weeks, I think. And she was prosecuted for that. Now, a lot of the backlashes come against the kind of idea of having an abortion law in place to say, oh, well, this poor woman was prosecuted for what she did, and she's a vulnerable woman. And I completely agree that she was a vulnerable woman, and that this was a terrible thing that happened. Carla Foster describes what happened as something that was hugely traumatic. She said she is haunted by the sight of the baby that she gave birth to, who she later named Lily, who she held in her arms, this dead baby. And she had the most horrendous experience, and a 34-year-old, viable, healthy child who had every right to be born alive, to grow up, to experience life, is now dead. And the criminal law being in place protects two of those lives in the situation. It protects the life of baby Lily, who should have been able to be born alive, even if that meant she was later placed to adoption or whatever those circumstances were. We could have found a better solution than her life being ended. And it also protects Carla, because Carla went through the most horrendous experience, and we don't want more women to go through those experiences of having a late-term abortion, there's a lot of misinformation about what abortion is. A lot of people don't think about it. They think that you kind of go into the hospital and you take a pill and then the baby just disappears. It's sorry, there's a notification. I'm gonna have to.
That's fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation on abortion. People think the baby just disappears once you take a pill, especially in later term abortion. It's a really traumatic experience, and the baby has to come out somehow. So I think the criminal law can be absolutely defended in terms of protecting those lives. Now, as to the specific question of does a criminal law increase or decrease abortion, my husband has written a paper on this, so I will pass that over to him.
Yeah, this is one of the things where it's a commonly claimed thing that the law doesn't work, it doesn't make a difference, and in academic circles, it's still sometimes treated as controversial. The reality is that we have absolutely conclusive evidence that the law does make an impact. And I say that for a number of reasons. There are dozens and dozens of papers which show that this is the case. I think the most obvious is the kind of paper which studies women who go to get abortions and then are turned away. There was a recent study of this kind in the US called the Turnaway Study, which is run by pro-choice authors, etc. And what they found is that when women cannot get an abortion in the US, they have an option, right? They can have the baby, or they could go to another state to get an abortion, or they could go to another country, or they could order illegal pills, or whatever. And what they found was that instead of all those other options, 70% of the women had the baby. So these were women who were absolutely determined to get an abortion. They were going to do so. They went to the clinic. 70% of them ended up having the baby when they were told that they couldn't get an abortion because they were too far along in pregnancy. And there are many, many other studies of the same kind which show that. We also have studies showing that abortion restrictions can increase the birth rates, which obviously means that those babies are not being illegally aborted, they're being born instead. We also have studies that show when you have a good estimate of illegal abortions, in the UK, they estimated before legalization, there were about 20,000 illegal abortions a year, maybe 50,000 at the sort of higher end of the estimates. We now have 200,000 every year in the UK. The same in Ireland, where they legalized abortion a few years ago. Every year it's just kept increasing and increasing after legalization, even though we know that there are not, illegal abortions going on, which account for these increases. So there really are just so many different pieces of evidence, and if anyone's interested, they can go to my website to read more. But it really is the kind of thing where if I see another academic say it, I feel comfortable saying this should not even be published in academia
Yeah.
just because it is so clearly wrong. It's basically like saying COVID is not real. It's like saying the earth is flat. For me, that's how wrong it is.
Mhm.
The evidence is so absolutely conclusive that laws on abortion do have an impact on
Yeah.
this.
And let me just chime in one last time as well on that question. When abortion was legalized in the US, we had this very famous slogan, safe, legal, and rare, which is kind of carried on into other countries as well. And that the whole concept was that, okay, it needs to be safe, so we need to end what we call backstreet abortion. And we have all these kind of horror stories of wire coat hangers and horrible, horrible situations. Interestingly, especially since COVID, but a lot of countries have now legalized what's called telemedicine abortions, where a woman can call up at an abortion provider and say, "Hi, I am less than 10 weeks pregnant. I want to have an abortion." And they say, "Are you sure you're less than 10 weeks?" She says, "Yes." And they say, "Okay, no problem. Send pills by post." And the lady or the woman conducts her own abortion herself at home. Now, this is very interesting to me that this is seen as a pro-woman advancement, because what this means is that a 16-year-old can call up without her parents knowing. She can lie or mistake or perhaps lead the abortion provider to think that she is less far along than she says, and there's many cases of that happening. So she can say, she might be 20 weeks and she says she's 10 weeks, which makes it a very unsafe situation for her to carry out her own abortion herself. The pills come by the post. She has an abortion in her bathroom. It's a traumatic experience. She probably doesn't want to tell her mom and dad downstairs why she's bleeding so much. All of these things are things that happen now that we have pills by post normalized across a lot of the West. So to me, to say that the kind of argument that abortion is safer now that it's legal has lost a lot of respect. Because we were told that it wouldn't happen, that you would finally get medical supervision and women wouldn't have to do them by themselves, and they wouldn't be kind of bathrooms, and in fact they are, and that's the consequence of the law. So I find that pretty difficult as well.
It seems like overall, though, maybe where a lot of people's concern is, the law seems like a very blunt tool. And you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation the way in which the Christian faith reshaped the Roman Empire by providing a vision of human equality and the dignity of the life of all people, and especially the role of Christians in taking in those who were left out to die from exposure and in the practice of infanticide, and taking them in as part of their family and raising them. And so this really winning of a heart and raising of the moral conscience. I wonder what for the two of you would be the end game of your pro-life convictions. How do you think society needs to a different story, different mechanisms, so that horrendous figure, of some 70 million potential abortions every year, that can become a much smaller number? What would you like to see happen overall?
I would love to see a society where abortion is not only unnecessary but unwanted, that no woman feels that she has to have an abortion. We know from statistics from the BBC that almost 1 in 5 women who have an abortion say they were pressured into it, whether that's from a partner, from economic or social circumstances. I think the pro-life movement is fighting for a society where no woman feels that she wants an abortion, because honestly, no little girl grows up wishing that she could have an abortion. It's never an ideal scenario. It's never a goal. It's always a worst case scenario. So I would love to see a society that supports men and women to be able to be parents, to feel supported in doing so, and that is the natural conclusion of responsibility for adults who conceive a child, to say, okay, we're going to raise this child, we're going to be supported to do so, we're going to be able to maintain what we need to do to maintain our economic sources, etc. And build a society that's fundamentally pro-life in supporting every woman and every baby.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's about protecting both. And so, neither of us want to see women controlled. Neither of us want to see people punished. We want to see people protected from abortion. The law can be a blunt tool, but there's also a reason for that, in that, when you look at international human rights legislation, it will look like an incredibly blunt tool if you forget that the courts don't have a say in this. So, it says these rights should never be violated, etc. And it's very absolutist in its terminology. But the reality is that the courts also have a role in determining culpability, pressure on women, etc. And for that sort of reason, it's pretty much unheard of that a woman would ever have, go to jail or anything in our country. Malta, for example, doesn't have abortion for any reason at all. In Europe, they completely ban abortion except if the woman's life is at risk. I don't think they can even remember when the last woman prosecuted was, because they have an approach which says women are often the victims as well. They are often pressured into it. And so it's fundamentally not about, controlling women or anything like that. It's about protecting both the women and the child by helping them to flourish rather than to pit them against each other in conflict.
Yeah, I would say that those pro-life legal approaches are ultimately in line with international human rights legislation. I used to work for ADF at the United Nations, and the body of international human rights law, which almost all countries are subscribed to, is implicitly pro-life. It protects the right to life for every human being. It says, for example, in one of its core human rights treaties that, even if in situations where the death penalty is allowed, it shouldn't be allowed for a pregnant mother because it separates the rights of those two individuals and protects one. So pro-life laws are inherently, on the right side of history. They're the ones that were crafted following the Second World War to ensure that human rights violations were prosecutable and would be prevented from happening. So being in line with this kind of pro-life thoughts is ultimately what I would call progressive in terms of moving towards a society with more respect for human rights. And like I say, on the right side of history.
Suppose someone's watching this and they have had an abortion, and one of the painful things about hearing stories like this is they have a degree of regret. Maybe they think it was the only decision available to them at the time. Maybe they're convinced it's still the right thing, but there's some trauma and hurt associated with that. It can be so easy to hear the pro-life position as standing up on a moral platform and condemning people for an action that they took. What does the Christian story contribute to this? What might you imagine that if Jesus comes across such a woman, that he might say to her?
Yeah, I think we actually have a really good idea. When you look at Luke chapter 7, I would really encourage anyone who might be feeling this to look at Luke chapter 7. It basically describes a situation where Jesus has gone to the Pharisees' house and he's eating with them, and these are the important religious people, the people who do everything right. And a woman comes in and she starts crying and wiping his feet with her tears and her hair and anointing his head with oil. And the Pharisees say, if this man were really a prophet, he would know who this woman is. That was their whole picture of this woman, is that she was a sinner. That was her entire identity. And the Pharisees said, look, this woman has done something wrong. If Jesus was really sent from God, he would know who this woman is, and he would never allow her to do that. And of course, the Christian story is that Jesus was a prophet. He was sent from God. He was God, and he did allow that woman to do that. So he let someone who was completely despised and in shame and condemned by the religious people, he said, you have the authority to wipe the feet and anoint the head with oil of the King of the universe, the God himself. And he gave that authority to that woman and not to the Pharisees, who had done everything else right. And the reason for that is because she trusted in Jesus and she saw who he was. And he said, everything from your past is wiped away because you trust in me. And so at the very end, he actually says, your faith has saved you, go in peace. And so for me, that's really the heart of this, is that Jesus's message for someone in that situation, which, as I remind you, it's not just a woman who's had an abortion, it's a man who's paid for an abortion, who's encouraged an abortion, who's pressured a woman to have an abortion, who has stayed silent in the face of it. This is all of us. This is not just about what does Jesus say to women in that situation. This is what does Jesus say to everyone who has fallen short of God's standard in this area or in any other area. Jesus says, you have the authority to approach me in this way, that you can anoint my head with oil, wipe my feet with your tears, approach the throne of God himself with confidence. And he says at the end, your faith has saved you, go in peace. So there were two kinds of people who went away from the house that day. There were the people who went away with shame and condemnation, and there were the people who went away with their heads held high, honored by God himself. And it's the complete opposite of what we would expect. The people who went away ashamed and in condemnation were the Pharisees who had done everything right. The people who went away honored and with peace were the people who were despised and who were sinners, but who Jesus says, you belong to me and I forgive you. And so that, I think, is how people should be stepping away from these conversations with those exact words from Jesus, go in peace, because those are the exact words that he said to a woman who was in this kind of situation. Go in peace.
I so appreciate that. Guys, thanks so much for being willing to come on the channel and to speak to a really heavy subject on abortion, and to do it with such wisdom and clarity and compassion is just a gift. If anyone wanted to follow up and get more from you, I know, Callum, you run a really useful blog, and Lois, for the group that you're working with and any of your speeches, where can they go online to be able to find that content?
Sure. Well, to find about ADF International's work protecting life and other fundamental freedoms around the world, it's adfinternational.org. And I'm on Twitter at Lois McLatch, which is where I post a lot of the stuff that we're doing and highlight a lot of interesting cases about life. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
Cool.
Yeah, and for me, if you go to callumsblog.com, what you will find there is an abortion Q&A. So any question that you have about abortion should be answered there. So it goes into a lot more detail about those difficult cases we discussed, about the role of the law, about the medical evidence, about all of these things, just in a lot more detail with all the scientific references. So callumsblog.com, you should be able to find everything there.
Thanks so much, guys. Well, I'm sure everyone's going to be diving in. We'll put links to those two in the show notes so that you can find that easy just below the YouTube video. And Callum and Lois, if you had one parting message to someone who's watching this and perhaps considering Christianity, what would it be?
Yeah, I think I would say keep considering it, but don't consider it forever. Actually dive in. Yeah, we have a lot of friends who are kind of on the edge, Christianity adjacent, and they see that Christianity has great values. We have a lot of friends here in the UK who say, I live like a Christian, isn't that enough? And, Christianity gave us human rights, it gave us human equality, it gave us a stable society, it gave us the importance of the family and all of these things that have shaped society, and all the social justice stuff, the work against poverty, the treasuring of the marginalized, and so on. And they say that's, if we can just reclaim that in society, that would be great. We've lost that on a societal level, but if we just get that back, that would be great. And if we live like Christians, the world will be a better place. But as I was saying to someone who asked me this the other day, that's kind of not the point of Christianity. Christianity gave us all of this good stuff, but that's actually a side effect of Christianity. Yeah. Because the core of Christianity is that it is fundamentally about a relationship that says it is not what you have done that will lead to eternal life. It is that someone has already done that for you, has taken the punishment, and who has offered you eternal life because of grace alone. And so, especially when we're talking about a subject like this, where it's so easy to come at it with shame or guilt or condemnation, I think Christianity is the only message that can really get us out of this, because one side will tell you there's nothing to get out of because abortion is fine, it's a woman's right. The other side, in other religions perhaps, might tell you, well, it's a huge sin and it's something that maybe is too difficult to forgive, or you're going to have to work really, really hard to overcome that. Christianity is the only message that says something else entirely. It says you can have completely fresh start. You can have a completely new slate. You can have complete forgiveness. You don't have to walk away with an ounce of condemnation or guilt or shame, because Jesus has done all of that for you, and you can live in a new life starting today. So my message would be, consider it further, look into the evidence. The evidence will stand up to scrutiny, but don't consider it forever, because there's something far, far better that waits for you at the other end.
Amen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate you coming on. And to everyone who's been watching this far, you've done awesome getting to the end of the video. As always with Questioning Christianity, you can find us on social media at QC Socials across all the channels for more video content and for some helpful infographics. If you're watching this and you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe and then click the bell for notifications on YouTube to see all our weekly content as it comes out. And we'll say bye for now, but as always, until next time, truth invites questioning. See you later.